5-minute flash talk on the research I've been doing with the MSP LTER, the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, with Professor Bonnie Keeler. So with that, I will start. 1 second, let me close something so I can see my screen. Great. So our research is on urban nature, race, and redlining in the Twin Cities, along with my colleagues Antara Mandal, Rebecca Walker, Hannah Raymer, and Dr. Bonnie Keeler. So our task, we are question 3.1 across the LTER network, and they gave us 3 research questions to look into, mostly looking into how the natural environment interacts with different types of infrastructure to determine wealth and resources, how much have investments in natural environment shaped the wealth gap, and what are opportunities to intervene in these systems. And so our question is, what role did race and redlining and nature play in redlining and the subsequent construction of real estate value in the Twin Cities? And it's not going. There we go. Okay, so just a real quick, what is redlining? So the Homeowners Loan Corporation, or called HOLC, was an emergency federal agency established during the Depression by the Homeowners Loan Act of 1933. This created a system where they created an A to D grading scale that ranged from best to hazardous and was influenced by residents' race, ethnicity, and class. So these redlining maps were accompanied by area descriptions that contain descriptions of the neighborhood and their demographics, their characteristics, location, and other traits of the neighborhood. So this is the redlining map from 1935 to 1940 in the Twin Cities. So green is the best A, blue is B, which is still desirable. C is yellow, which means declining, and then D was red and considered hazardous. And so this corresponded with mortgage lenders and whether or not they would issue federally insured mortgages. And so if you're in a redlined area, you would not receive a federally insured mortgage. You'd have to go through other options to try to secure loans for housing. And so you can see that in the Twin Cities, the best areas around the lakes, B'dai-Maka-Ska, Nokomis, and Mac Groveland over here. And then the redline areas are today, where we see a lot of industrial siting along the river. We have the Phillips neighborhood over here. The Herc trash incinerator burner is over here. So we can see how that has kind of influenced the structure of Minneapolis and St. Paul over time. So next, our method was we coded these area descriptions for mentions of race and environmental amenities and disamenities. And so environmental amenities beautify the neighborhood and were considered desirable influences on property values, where environmental disamenities were considered detrimental influences. This is a picture of one of the area descriptions that we went through, talking about how the lake is desirable, and then talking about the encroachment of people of color, threatening the desirability of the neighborhood. And so we coded the entire Twin Cities, and our results here show that environmental amenities are more prevalent in A and B neighborhoods. So this is a 100% stacked bar graph, and then underneath the words is the number of times that was mentioned. So for example, for Lake, it was mentioned 19 times, almost 60% of the time in A neighborhoods, less in B, the rest in C, and no mention of lakes in any D neighborhoods. And then on the flip side, we can see that for industry, it was mentioned 27 times, less than 10% in an A neighborhood. This one actually mentioned it, saying that the industry was not encroaching and not impacting the property value. And then we can see that these more detrimental environmental disamenities were located in more C and D neighborhoods. And then we can also see that racialized groups are mentioned more often in C and D neighborhoods. So either we considered no mention of race to be white, because they did mention race in every other instance. And so in A neighborhoods, they either didn't mention race at all, or they only mentioned Scandinavian backgrounds. And then we can see for Black and Asian, more mentions concentrated in the C and D rated neighborhoods. So this is the environmental amenities map from 1935, with a darker color correlating to higher amounts of amenities. So we see that in the higher graded A and B areas where there are more lakes, more parks. And so we see that in these areas closer to the city and the river, where industrial siting and minority populations live, there are less mentions of environmental amenities. So the impacts on home value, this is by Minneapolis and St. Paul. They gave average, minimum, and maximum home values. And so we can see that much higher home values are correlated with higher Hulk grades. And then this is the average number of mentions of amenities and disamenities in each of these. So we see that each A-rated neighborhood had on average about 2 positive environmental features and barely any negative ones. And then almost the opposite for D neighborhoods, almost 1 mention per neighborhood and not many mentions of positive environmental features. And then this is the house value map for the Twin Cities from 1935. So if you overlaid this with the Hulk map and the environmental amenities map, you'd see that the highest home values are associated in those A and B neighborhoods with access to environmental amenities like lakes and parks, and that home values are much lower or maybe not even able to be properly calculated because of the lack of home value that's been reported in these neighborhoods. So conclusions, impacts, and next steps. The conclusions we drew were that higher Hulk grades are associated with more environmental amenities, that they are associated with a higher percent of white residents, and that greenness and whiteness are correlated with higher property values. Implications, historic redlining is directly related to the Twin Cities having the largest racial home ownership gap in the country, with only 19% of Black individuals owning homes in the Twin Cities versus 77% of white individuals. And this could also give quantitative evidence for reparations as we can track these home values over time. So our next step, we've actually analyzed a total of 9 cities in the Midwest to find if patterns are consistent, and we're working on publishing a paper right now. So I know with time concerns, I'll stick around for after, but with that, I wanted to introduce today's speaker. So Dr. Jessica Samuel is an educator, interdisciplinary scholar, and decolonial activist whose work focuses on race, education, colonialism, and the environment, including where they might all converge in the United States and the Caribbean. She's the founder and CEO of Radical Education and Advocacy League, LLC, an educational equity firm focused on improving educational outcomes among BIPOC students. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Boston University, a Master's of Education from the University of Missouri-St. Louis, and a Bachelor's in African American Studies and Anthropology from Wesleyan University. Dr. Samuel is also an alumna of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship, Teach for America, and the Institute for Recruitment of Teachers. Currently, she resides in the U.S. Virgin Islands, where she was born and raised. And at today's environmental justice seminar, Dr. Samuels will present her talk, Saving America's Paradise, the Colonial Nature of Disaster Relief in the U.S. Virgin Islands. So with that, we can all welcome Dr. Samuel. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ruby. Let me get myself together here. And thank you also for your talk, which is very interesting. All right. Can I just confirm that everyone's seeing this okay? All right. Perfect. Thank you all. Okay. So thank you all so much for having me here. And special thanks to the graduates and organizers of this speaker series on environmental justice. I am very excited for this opportunity to add to the amazing body of work on environmental justice already shared with the University of Minnesota community, and also to be doing so while in the comfort of the warmth. Though I am from the US Virgin Islands, and that is where I reside primarily, at the moment I am not there. I'm actually in Houston, Texas, where the weather is still nice. And so I just want to, extend my deepest condolences to you all over there in Minnesota. I understand that the weather is not as forgiving or generous. I hope that you all are taking care and staying as warm as you can, because it's April and it should be warm everywhere. And on that note, today's talk is entitled Saving America's Paradise, the Colonial Nature of Disaster Relief in the US Virgin Islands, a place I'm sure many people would love to be at this time. This talk is actually based on the penultimate chapter of my 2021 American Studies dissertation, entitled Consuming the US Virgin Islands, Conservation and Education in America's Paradise. My dissertation examines the ways an expansive, continuous, and layered American project of empire, which also includes conservation colonialism, a term that I've coined, fosters the physical and intellectual displacement of the native people of St. John. I will begin today's talk by describing the impact of the most recent disaster, natural disaster, to devastate the US Virgin Islands in 2017, as well as the responses to it, both governmental and otherwise. I will then proceed to examine the history of coloniality in the islands and how this history informs disaster relief in the territory, and particularly on the smallest yet wealthiest national park island of St. John. I will then end this talk by connecting American processes of domination and exploitation to disaster response, and conceptions of environmental justice. So let's jump in. In 2017, Hurricanes Irma and Maria, jointly referred to as Irmaria by locals, left homes flattened, shorelines demolished, and waterfronts totally flooded. Mudslides and strong winds decimated most of the infrastructure on the islands of St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John. My own mother's home, pictured in the left, in Lorraine Village Apartments on the island of St. Croix, had collapsed completely due to Maria's force. People of the American territory lived weeks without access to drinkable water, and more than 70% of homes were without power for more than 3 months. The only 2 hospitals in the territory, Governor Juan F. Louis Hospital and Schneider Regional Medical Center, respectively located on St. Croix and St. Thomas, lost power and experienced immense water damage, forcing hundreds of patients to be evacuated to already devastated Puerto Rico and the mainland US for treatment. Several schools throughout the islands were ruined and made to consolidate. For months, Virgin Island students attended classes on a rotational half-day schedule to accommodate those from schools that had been condemned due to the damages sustained by the storms. More than 6 years after the storm, some students still attend classes in the temporary FEMA modular classroom units that were placed on their playing fields. The catastrophe caused by both hurricanes, that is Maria and Irma, prompted thousands of islanders to flee the territory by mercy flights. Many of those who take advantage of the free or significantly reduced passage on planes and cruise ships to the continental US never returned. The scale of Irma Maria's impact reflected more than just the 2 hurricanes' collective strength. It is true that climate change, defined as distinct shifts in measures of climate lasting for a long period of time, continues to have a disproportionate impact on islands of the Caribbean due to their limited size, reliance upon the climate for subsistence, such as rainfall for water, and unique topographies. However, the colonialism under which many island nations and island territories have been and continue to be subjected not only amplifies, but in fact is cause for the effects of such climate-based disaster. As the Caribbean's colonial legacy as a playground and wonderland has created this reality where the environment and its people are its products. When these products are damaged and inoperable, whether due to natural disaster or other instances, their economies subsequently suffer. When taken together with a political economy that renders islands such as St. Croix, St. Thomas, and St. John helpless in time of trouble, natural disasters induced by climate change become complicated by a host of unnatural conditions. The legacy of dependency and exploitation, for example, that colonialism perpetuates in the Caribbean, creates a situation where in times of distress, many islands must rely on the metropoles that dominate or dominated them. Possessive labels such as America's Paradise, used to describe an entire set of people and their home, helped to effectively cement relationships predicated on subordination, consumption, and abuse. Thus, the US Virgin Islands climate sensitivity, the degree to which it and its people are vulnerable to variabilities in the weather, is exacerbated by the territory's fragile geography and the extractive political economy on which it runs. As the most coveted and least represented islands of the USVI, St. John is exceptionally vulnerable to the afflictions generated by natural disaster. In particular, its history as a national park established by Lawrence Rockefeller has encouraged colonial philanthropic responses to disaster on the island. For a place like St. John, the disaster of Irma Maria has been both an event and a process. The structural deficiencies characteristic of life in a territory, coupled with the geographic limitations to space caused by a national park occupying over 2/3 of the island, made it near impossible to weather the aftermath of Irma Maria at home. A political economy marked by neglect, underfunding, and an overzealous tourism industry created a condition wherein the realities of climate-based disaster were more pronounced for the Black and Brown people of St. John. The image on the left here is of downtown Cruz Bay, which is a main city in St. John. And the image on the right, as you can see, is a map of the island. So St. John is roughly 19 square miles. And 2/3 of that, including submerged lands, is owned by the Virgin Islands National Park. While many advocacy and activist-based organizations have conceptions of colonial environmental practices and policies, there's a great body of literature, or I wouldn't say necessarily great, but there is a body of literature emerging around the coloniality of certain environmental practices and conservation in specific. Yet the field in general is still wanting of a very definitive and cogent definition and explanation of what I've termed conservation colonialism. Through my research, I've taken the liberty of creating a working framework of the set of consistent practices, attitudes, and policies that help to explain this phenomenon. I define conservation colonialism as the unhinged pursuit of environmental conservation at the expense of native populations. It is driven by a desire to museumize nature as a means of monopolizing the natural resources of the world and controlling the way racialized communities access and use said resources. Conservation colonialism is historically marked by European and Euro-American descendant peoples' paradoxical overutilization of resources as a justification for their protection. I've identified 3 main features of conservation colonialism, and they are: 1, the hoarding of natural resources, usually by and/or for Europeans or European descendants. 2, the erasure of native and indigenous perspectives. 3, the displacement of native or indigenous populations. So how does conservation colonialism, as I've defined it, impact natural disaster and its effects? In other words, how does this particular rendering of the natural environment influence what disaster mitigation even looks like for a place considered America's paradise? More specifically, what happens when climate-based disaster strikes America's Park Island in America's paradise? Jeff Quinlan, then leader of Love City Strong, which is one of the disaster relief organizations that emerged on St. John in the wake of Irma Maria, in his Facebook post, helps to instruct on the kinds of colonial attitudes and mindsets that often travel with continental metropolitan transplants to US territories. In his post shared in 2019, a few years after the storms, Jeff responds to Puerto Rican protesters' call to decolonize the islands and pursue political self-determination as a response to the devastation and responses to the devastation caused by the storms. In the spirit of what I would call derisiveness, Jeff outlines the magnitude of structural challenges facing territorial governments that would make such a transition difficult, if not totally impossible. At the same time, he lauds the federal government and its private agents for their part in preventing the dumpster fire that the islands would otherwise be if ever the federal government pulled out. Certainly, inequalities in governance and the distribution of federal aid had caused the literal and figurative deaths of island people, and the private sector's intervention had done much to rectify that. However, it cannot be lost that the corporate investment in disaster mitigation to eventually come about in the US Virgin Islands generally and on St. John specifically was due to St. John's inflated significance as a park island and site of many non-native millionaires' assets. The island's relationship to white wealth and mainland corporate networks enabled its protection through the assistance of philanthrocapitalist entities like Bloomberg LC, belonging to Michael Bloomberg, and Kenny Chesney's No Shoes Nation. However, it is these same connections to non-native, largely white corporate capital and culture that has helped produce the vulnerabilities that make natural hazards so devastating to local island people. The imaginative production of wilderness constructed by the Virgin Islands National Park, along with the coloniality of philanthropy on St. John, have worked in tandem to render the island a consumable space and consequently expose it to exploitative aid. For their part, local St. Johnians, native St. Johnians, ancestral native St. Johnians, there are various descriptions to describe people who identify as the original people to the island, post-slavery, accounting for like the complete obliteration of indigenous communities that were met by colonizers from Europe. They identify as largely African descendant, and they date themselves in the islands as far back as when the first set of settlers came to the islands and brought enslaved Africans with them. All of these individuals, including some what are often referred to as Eastern Caribbean migrants or other West Indian, British West Indian immigrants that come from neighboring islands but are not native to the US Virgin Islands, which was once the Danish West Indies prior to being sold. These individuals are represented when I refer to local St. Johnians, and they're primarily African descendants. So for their part, local St. Johnians, this entire demographic and community, have continued to resist the disproportionate influence that the mostly white, continentally derived American disaster recovery teams have exercised over disaster relief in this majority Afro-Caribbean island space. In 2019, a little less than 2 years after the storm and just 2 weeks after the US Virgin Islands would celebrate its 171st anniversary of Danish emancipation, did members of a St. John Cultural Heritage Collective, together with various concerned citizens, pen an open letter accusing two major disaster recovery groups of discriminatory hiring practices, naming Kenny Chesney's Love for Love City, LFLC, and Bloomberg affiliate group, Love City Strong, LCS. The letter explained how almost 2 years after the hurricanes, the long-term recovery organizations created post-storms were not inclusive enough of St. John's diverse populations. Authors and signatories of the letter believe the organizations had overlooked qualified ancestral and generational Virgin Islanders, quote, capable of filling leadership and management positions, end quote. Not only did letter writers perceive that Native Islanders had been grossly discounted by the disaster nonprofit apparatus on St. John, they also recognized how cronyism throughout the organizations exacerbated the possibilities of locals obtaining positions of leadership. And this is like the fuller quote of what I've shared here on the screen. It says, It seems there is little room for people from the Virgin Islands and other Caribbean islands to join in the management of these organizations. There is considerable overlap between LCS, Love City Strong, and LFLC, Love for Love City, meaning fewer available positions. For example, John McKennis is a co-chair of the executive board of directors at LCS and serves as director of LFLC. Jeff Quinlan, previously mentioned, is a staff member at LCS. Furthermore, LCS's executive director, Megan Enright, was previously the community relations person for Chesney's Foundation before she was director for Love City Strong. In an environmentally just recovery, the management team and board members of critical relief organizations will be culturally sensitive, knowledgeable about the Virgin Islands and its people, and appropriately qualified to recognize the relationship between inequality and vulnerability in disaster areas. This means a more diverse staff that is representative of the island's population. End quote. Writers ended their letter of grievances with a list of recommendations for remedying some of the perceived inequities within the recovery nonprofits on the island. Chief among them was the recruitment and hiring of ancestral St. Johnians, native Virgin Islanders, and Caribbean people in general in the management and leadership ranks of the disaster recovery teams, rather than just in dispatch teams, which is how they were previously employed. This letter, as you might imagine, along with this list of recommendations, incited outrage, threats, and conflict, both in virtual communities curated by various on and off island stakeholders of St. John, as well as throughout regularly patronized white-owned establishments on the island. Many white continentals and some local Black residents pegged the letter writers and their supporters as, quote, troublemakers, and even racists for making what they deemed to be unnecessary and irrelevant critique of the, quote, good work the recovery groups had been doing. Many felt that by drawing so much attention to race relations, the letter had disregarded the positive accomplishments of the disaster nonprofits. Buried beneath this pushback, however, was the sentiment that organizations like Love for Love City and Love City Strong should be absolved from any criticism at all. In the minds of many, drawing attention to these organizations' imbalanced and unrepresentative leadership was an unnecessary effort that not only echoed of ungratefulness, but also distracted from perhaps more important issues. And that there are things more important than racial inclusivity, equity, and justice on an island like St. John, experiencing the throes of gentrification, tells of St. John's troubling predicament as a possession of the United States. The expectation that St. Johnians are to maintain a disposition of gratitude, even in the face of harmful behavior, epitomizes the island's geopolitical and ecological histories. The combative exchange that ensued on St. John at the heels of the open letter calls forth the ways the environment shapes and is shaped by disaster aid, and colonialism. I argue that disaster, colonialism, and capitalism, alongside unchecked white philanthropy or racialized charity work, right? A philanthropy that inhibits self-determination and erases local people's own capacities for recovery and generating new futures for themselves, that these processes, that these phenomena go hand in hand. The political predicament of US territories expose exactly how predatory and colonial American philanthropy can be, especially where that philanthropy is foundationally concerned with the preservation of romanticized island spaces. In these Caribbean paradise islands, philanthropy inherently replicates colonialism, if not can serve as a complete agent of it. Indeed, any scenario where the people responsible for constructing these imaginaries of paradise, its allure, its product, its value, its function, also become the ones responsible for saving it, is a scenario where the inhabitants who live on said islands never stood a chance at actual recovery. Scholarship on unnatural disaster, climate change, capitalism, and colonialism all elucidate how systems of devastation and dispossession interlock to produce situations of impossibility for marginal communities. When situated within a geography of American disaster and American empire, disaster relief on St. John reveals some of the worst aspects of this term that I've coined conservation colonialism. In addition, disaster relief marks the continuities of the white philanthropy's paternalism that initially plagued the island at the formation of the Virgin Islands National Park by Florence Rockefeller, as well as a structural neglect endemic to island territories that belong to the US, but aren't actually part of the US. Still, this story is only one of many cases where the US has exploited disaster, natural and unnatural, for capital investment and profit in communities of color around the world. The disaster capitalism veiled in philanthropic intervention to plague New Orleans also showed up in St. John, for example. In that instance, Naomi Klein, one such scholar on the topic, argued that it is in the midst of this shock, post-disaster shock, that state agents and private companies work together to obtain the most leverage to enact their economic and political schemes that are most beneficial to them and their organizations. Communities hit by devastation and conflict are less able to act and react to these aggressive ventures, no matter how detrimental to their livelihood they may appear to be, because they're so busy processing the trauma of disaster. These images that I have on the screen here are an example of this form of disaster colonialism and disaster capitalism specifically that tends to creep in the midst of philanthropy or disaster aid, right? When private entities are responsible for bringing aid, though they oftentimes help to fill gaps, what we find is that alongside them, attendant to them, right? Whether intentionally or unintentionally, is often some type of economic venture. And so here we have Island Oasis, which was this like random pop-up startup company that ended up selling container homes in response to the disaster of the storms caused by the storms. And these homes, these containers were going for like $47,000 at least. You could imagine that so many Native peoples were unable to actually afford those. And they were, in all honesty, not even really marketed, I don't believe, to Native St. John people. Needless to say, this company no longer exists. And they came in, they made an attempt to make money, to capitalize on a disaster with no real consideration for how they could sort of generate new futures and realities for the people who had lost their homes. And when they couldn't, they left. Emergency responses to storms reflect pre-existing inequalities and the way social stratification determines which communities receive aid, and sometimes whether at all they do, in a timely manner, and which others have to deal with the burdens of bureaucratic malfunction. For the American Caribbean islands of Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, the current conditions of coloniality defines the ways people from these islands experience and mitigate disaster. Situated within what Yarimar Bonilla, one social scientist who covers and actually coined and came up with this concept of disaster colonialism, which was an extension of disaster capitalism and situated within the specific context of American island nations, or territories rather. She calls this US archipelago of racialized neglect. I'm sure many of you can recall what was going on in 2017 in the news cycle, where like half of America was struggling to even conceive of the fact that the US had territories, and were so sort of frazzled by that idea and confounded by what that even meant. You know, what were territories? How many did we have? What were the relationship? Were we even responsible? And before that conversation, the immediate knee-jerk reaction by many Americans, continental Americans that is, was to say that there was no need for US intervention in Puerto Rico, and don't even talk about the US Virgin Islands because we weren't actually even mentioned by name as often, if at all. And a lot of it is because of this hidden nature of colonialism, right? This hidden nature of American empire. And the ways in which the United States is able to sort of continue to propagate itself as a nation of democracy with no modern day live possessions, when that's just the furthest thing from the truth. So this sort of experience of racialized neglect that the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico endured was very much tied up to the very conceptions of these spaces and who predominantly inhabited them, and therefore their value to the United States. This archipelago, as she says, right, it causes a disaster of its own, which then leads for natural disaster in these American colonies to really operate in a way that exposes the success of US occupation, US domination, as well as the inconsistencies, right, and consistencies of American aid and even American racism. The US Virgin Islands specifically were purchased from Denmark by the United States in 1917 for 25 million gold coins. Citizenship to the inhabitants of these islands that were once known as the Danish West Indies was not conferred onto the majority African descendant population until 1927, and then again in 1932 because of certain stipulations around people who were in the mainland US at the time of the sale, but not physically on island. So they had to get their citizenship later. The US Navy administered these islands until 1931, and inhabitants were not able to elect their own governor until 1970. Okay, that's very, very late. As inhabitants of a US territory, Virgin Islanders cannot vote for the President of the United States while living and residing in the United States, in the US Virgin Islands. And nor are they allotted or allocated a voting representative in Congress. We have a non-voting delegate. We don't have a senator or a congressman or congresswoman. To this day, the islands are governed by the Revised Organic Act of 1954, rather than a territorial constitution, which is what Puerto Rico has. While much of the rhetoric around disaster response has been a push for resiliency, and this kind of mitigation response or readiness, what this actually does, this rhetoric, is it harms island colonies like the US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico because of its part in helping to perpetuate what Bonilla refers to as the larger dominance of neoliberal forms of governmentality, which can be found in philanthrocapitalism, right? These types of neoliberal interventions help to refashion citizenship that is already precarious for island territories as individualized self-care rather than the literal political arrangements that help to impact social safety and state accountability. It is through a formula involving conservation colonialism and disaster colonialism that disaster relief, spearheaded by wealthy white financiers on the island of St. John, can be understood as an exaggeration of territoriality and racial capitalism. Situated within an American project of anti-Blackness and the material exploitation of others, St. John's recovery from Irma Maria is an exemplification of US empire's prevalence, persistence, and surveillance through privately funded machines, philanthropic, private, economic, and all. The grievances within the open letter expose the gaps in St. John's and the broader Virgin Islands political economy, consistently dependent on a third-class citizenship to the mainland US, The territory has long struggled to access the resources and capital that will allow it to truly be self-sufficient. On St. John, or at the very least to self-determine, not even at the very least, more specifically and more importantly, to self-determine. On St. John, disaster aid in the form of philanthropy is used as a tool for further engrafting the USVI to a position of dependency. While wealthy philanthropists often espouse an altruistic motive for helping in the specific context of the USVI, this help has inhibited Virgin Islands people's self-actualization rather than support it. Well-meaning philanthropic efforts directed by continentals who feel entitled to formulate a vision for how St. John should look and ultimately serve them are byproducts of a longer legacy of self-interested charity work and philanthropy, which can be traced back to Lawrence Rockefeller's very foundation and establishment of the national park, as he was the first white financier to St. John who found it fit for an existence as a national park. And numerous other wealthy white men on the mainland US have operated with certain attitudes similar to this. Emboldened by the structural inefficiencies of local and federal government systems, philanthrocapitalists, disaster colonialists, initiatives continue to take or have a stronghold on local affairs and to further aggravate the island people's marginal citizenship. As we consider the manifold ramifications of colonialism, it is imperative that we also examine the ways that wealth and race dictate power on an island. The deficit in capital many Virgin Islanders experience reduces the political power that they're able to wield in order to resist encroachments on their land by public, whether that's by way of the Virgin Islands National Park, and by private entities, whether that's through Bloomberg, LLC, etc. Nevertheless, natives continue to fight back on and offline through various platforms. They have made attempts to counter this epistemological violence that has aimed to portray St. John as an empty, romantic wilderness, free for the taking or free for the saving. I think that St. John is a very apt lesson in how climate and environmental injustice indicate more than just the disproportionate ways environmental dangers threaten vulnerable communities. Environmental justice must also include the anti-colonial work or decolonial work of resisting resource domination. And anti-colonial environmental justice recognizes that decisions and decision-making processes regarding the environment, who claims it and how they use it, and the natural resources therein should augment rather than derail the quality of life afforded to racialized and indigenous, or at least the least powerful and most vulnerable communities now and into the future. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that was an incredible presentation, Dr. Samuel. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing that. The floor is open for questions now, so you can either use the Q&A function to type in your question, or you can raise your hand to ask a question out loud and we will call on you. So yeah, go for it. We have a question from Ruby. Ruby asks, how do you involve/center local residents and community stakeholders in your work?
It's a good question, Ruby. Thank you. So I involve and center community in my work through methodology. I think that's where it begins for me, especially as a scholar, entrepreneur. I know I'm not squarely in academia right now at the moment, and that's intentional. I'm still deeply involved in research and scholarship and writing, and the work continues to evolve even without sort of formal affiliations with the institution or the university. And I'd say that from the very beginning of this scholarship and even now, thinking about how I do and conduct my research has been one of the most important ways of ensuring that this is community-centered scholarship, that this is really responding to what is happening on the ground. For my methodology for this dissertation project, which this particular presentation derives, right? I ended up going into the archives and I conduct oral histories, and then I also conducted ethnography. So I went back home. St. John is home to me. Though it's not where I was born, it's still a place that I grew up, as mentioned in my bio. And I made it a mission to really like re-immerse myself into the community. And I had been away from home for a very long time. And so doing that wasn't as easy as it may sound. I think sometimes and I'm not sure how familiar many of you here are with sort of autoethnography as a method in scholarship, because I know this is very environmental heavy, but I think there's room absolutely for autoethnography as a method in environmental studies in certain fields. But even if you are from a place and you may consider yourself native to a place, as a scholar, you occupy a particular positionality, which can oftentimes make you other, right? Or stranger. And so there's this continual contention between native and other, or outsider, insider, right? Is what several anthropologists refer to it as. And I really had to make up my mind that I would deal with all of the consequences of being an insider who is in many ways an outsider, but always centering the voices of local community people and giving them the opportunity to tell me, what it is that they've experienced, and looking at the product, looking at the artifacts as they present themselves. And so like literally when I was preparing to enter into the field, go and conduct my field work for my dissertation, was when this open letter was written. And I remember getting like heart palpitations because I was talking to my advisor at the time, Julian Go. I was like, I don't know what I should do right now. I'm about to go back home and it's about to explode. I don't know what's happening. Like, what should I do with this letter? Should I sign it? People kind of want me to sign it because I'm known and, in my capacity as an activist, and I'm from home and these things are important to me personally. And then I decided, I needed to just see what was happening and allow it to happen and take it for what it was without needing to sort of like involve myself too much or feel like it was too hot to touch. So I'd say that part of how I keep community involved is really about how I think about the work itself, right? And about what is evidence, where do you find evidence? And I think the more that we expand the notion of what is evidence and sort of what are like the histories that can be told about a particular issue or topic, the more we can find opportunities to include the voices of those who've historically been excluded.
Audrey, you have your hand raised. Go for it.
Yeah, I don't know how to put a chat or a question in the Q&A if I'm like a organizer or co-host, but Jessica, thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your other work that you do as a CEO of your own company and how this might translate it all into that, or if there's, any shared connections there.
Yeah, good question. Thank you, Audrey. So yeah, I am the founder and CEO of this consultancy called Radical Education and Advocacy League, and its acronym is REAL. to like to keep it real. And real is really important to me in my work as a scholar, activist, entrepreneur woman. Because it really, I think, if you go on my website and sort of like read my about, and you even go to my scholarship tab and like read how I see my work like making sense together, you will learn that, you know, real ultimately became sort of like the culmination of years of research and scholarship, in a way that I had kind of like always hoped in the back of my like heart and my mind, but never actually like intentionally sought after, right? It's so funny how our deepest desires will materialize themselves just by like staying the course and doing the thing that feels right. My work and like what I do really originates in education. You know, I'm an educator. I was with Teach for America after graduating from Wesleyan, and I taught high school English for 3 years. And it was in the classroom, you know, my second year, and I taught during the time of Mike Brown and the Ferguson uprisings. And that was a very tumultuous time as like a new teacher. And there was so much that I was learning about myself and my students at the time. And I recognized that there was something happening to the environment, right? Like the built environment, this like social environment, the political environment within which education was happening, public education within an inner city of St. Louis specific. And I wanted to spend some time sort of interrogating that more closely. I saw connections between my students, who are primarily African American, and my own experiences as an Afro-Caribbean woman coming from a US colony for all intents and purposes. And I really wanted to be able to investigate sort of like the coloniality of education as an American project and institution. And that's how I got back into academia and pursued a PhD in American Studies. And then I had an opportunity to specifically talk about education within the Caribbean at a conference in Cuba. And I could not, you know, not go to Cuba. So I ended up putting together this really interesting paper that forced me to look home. I was thinking about the US and the context of education and the environment of learning exclusively within sort of this inner city setting. And I hadn't really like turned my lens inward and looked at self to say, like, are there any examples of education operating colonial educator projects in the Caribbean or in the territory? And I ended up looking at St. John. And the first question that came to me as it relates to education, that is, was why is there no high school on St. John? That is literally the opening question. That was a segue into my work here in the field of like environmental studies. And by asking that question, I had to contend with St. John's situation as a national park island. Because growing up, it was just what it was. 2/3 of the island belonged to the national park. We had hiking trails. You know, I knew that there were always sort of like these local debates about encroachments on people's personal property and land and having to go to court with the Virgin Islands National Park and the Department of Interior. But I never really sort of processed it in any particular way, you know? And then by asking the question, I realized, oh, wait, like many people had been asking the Virgin Islands National Park to give up land for the first K-12 public school, because St. John to this day does not have a public high school, and it has never had a public high school. It only has schooling from K-8, and there's only one school remaining on the island, one public school remaining on the island. And the only high school, which I graduated from, is privatized. And that was a really important sort of moment for me, right? As a scholar, I realized that there were so many implications to the lack of quality education that went beyond some of the standard ones that we look for, right? Which is like corrupt government or inefficiencies in education administration and these kinds of things. I recognized the Virgin Islands National Park played a direct role in the local government's ability to secure land for a school. And so this is how my work came to really flourish and evolved. I recognized that the environment literally the natural environment, how we conceive of the environment, the definitions that we give it, the value that we assign to it, and who gets to do that, right? Who gets to value land and say, this ought to be preserved, and for whom, right? When we think about the history of conservation in the United States, it's a very racist one, okay? American conservation as an entire process and phenomenon is racist in origins. In fact, there's so many eugenicists affiliations and associations with how we even think about why we ought to conserve certain resources. And when we think about intergenerational equity or futurity, which is often sort of the justification for conservation, very rarely do we actually consider people from where I'm from. Very rarely do we think of Black people or Indigenous people, Native people, island people, when we think about how we preserve land and for whom and for what into the future. And so these questions became so relevant to the question of equity in education because of St. John's unique position and because of this issue of no schooling, no public high schooling on the island of St. John. So I took the opportunity to sort of blend all of my passions, that of education, that of wanting to better understand the environment and how we can create more equity and resources, and my knack for consulting to create this consultancy where we provide basically holistic consulting around issues pertaining to education and the environment, both in the United States and in the Caribbean. And that was very roundabout and very long-winded, but I hope that it answered your question.
It did. Thank you. I appreciate it. I think we are at time now. For any grad students that are left on the call, we will use the same Zoom link for our student reception. We'll start at 4:45, but just wanted to give everyone a chance for a little bit of a break before we come back. But yes, thank you everyone for attending. Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel. And thank you to Ruby too for her presentation too.
Thank you.
Friends, I sadly have to go to class, so I cannot be at the reception. But Dr. Samuel, thank you so much again. This was a huge honor to have you, and I really enjoyed your presentation. It was awesome meeting you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anu.
I also have to go to a work event, so I'm sorry, but thank you so much. And I look forward to following your work. It sounds really interesting.
Thank you, Ruby. I'm very excited about your work as well. Good luck on everything. I hope you continue to develop wonderful and impactful research.
Thanks so much. Have a good one, everyone.
Thank you, Ruby. Okay, so everyone left are like all these folks, they're grad students?
They will be, yeah, I
Okay,
assume
cool.
so. Or there'll be people who forgot that they were on Zoom and then never left the meeting, but hopefully it's mostly grad students.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
So we'll give
All
you
right.
like a 10-minute break and then come back.
Yeah.
Perfect. I'll be right back.